All right, let's talk about the Dragon of Rhodes. I know, I'm the Islam Crusades historian guy. Why am I talking about dragons? Well, this particular little known but interesting story occurs within the context of the long war between Islam and Christendom, and it involves a dragon. And besides, I've looked around on YouTube and I don't see any decent retellings of this story. And I've done a little bit of a deep dive, as it were, in this tale for another project I'm working on because it deals with Islam and Crusades. And so I figure at this season, this time of Christmas, take a break from the beheadings and the slaughters and the massacres, and let's talk about something a little more festive, like a dragon. Okay, so it's in the 1330s that this story occurs, and it's in the island of Rhodes. Rhodes is off the southwest coast of modern-day Turkey, back then Asia Minor. And Rhodes was the headquarters for the Knights of the Hospital, the Hospitallers, once they were ejected with the rest of the Crusaders out of the Holy Land in 1291. So in the 1330s, the story goes, a dragon started terrorizing the peoples of Rhodes. Their livestock disappeared. Some of their shepherds who got too close to the dragon's lair, which is said to have been in the marshes or the swamps near St. Stephen Mountain. They also were killed, disappeared, etc., etc. And a number of the knights of the hospital, the Knights of St. John, as they were better known, actually tried to go and slay the dragon. And apparently several of them went and were killed for it. At any rate, word reached the master of the order, Helion, or Elion, the master, and it got to the point where he said, nobody go fight the dragon. Everyone stay put, and he banned the people of Rhodes from going near the marshes or the lair of the dragon, and so forth. But one knight, a French knight, a young knight, by the name of Dieudonné, excuse my French, goes on, and I'm going to call him goes on for the rest of this. He's from the region of Gozan in France. But this young knight who had seen the dragon with his brethren but never fought it would not relent, and he devised a plan. He would go to Gozan in France, his father's castle, and train himself to fight the dragon. So he went there and created a replica, a large wooden replica. The dragon, the way it was described at the time, was about 70 feet tall or long from snout to tail, very scaly, typical dragon. And he reportedly created some sort of replica and started fighting against it. But he also trained two large, vicious dogs. Depending on which source you look at, they could have been bulldog type dogs or bloodhounds, but very large, aggressive, violent dogs. He trained them to attack and bite the underbelly of this replica dragon whenever he would fight it. And supposedly he did this for several weeks and months, etc., until the time came when he went back to Rhodes to launch his plan. So, once he had reached Rhodes and he was ready to exercise his plan, he, quote, went down the mountain with his two dogs, advanced straight to the marsh and haunt of the serpent, which, at the noise that he made, ran with open mouth and eyes darting fire to devour him. This is actually from the Chronicles and from the chief historian of the Hospital of St. John, and we'll discuss the significance of that. And he continues, Gozan gave it a stroke with his lance, which the thickness and hardness of the dragon's scales made of no effect. He was preparing to redouble his stroke when his horse, frightened with the hissing and stench of the serpent, refuses to advance, retires back and leaps aside, and would have been the occasion of his master's destruction if he, goes on, with presence of mind, had not thrown himself off the horse. Then taking his sword in hand, and attended by his two faithful dogs, he immediately comes up to the horrible, stinking beast, and gives it several strokes in different places. But the hardness of the scales hindered them from entering, and the furious beast, with a stroke of his tail, threw him on the ground, and would infallibly have devoured him if his two dogs, according as they had been taught, had not seized the serpent by the belly, which they tore and mangled with their teeth, though it struggled with all its strength to force them to quit their hold. The knight, by the help of this succor, gets up and, joining his two dogs, thrusts his sword up to the hilt in a place that was not defended by scales. He there makes a large and gaping wound, whence a deluge of blood flows out. Thus was the great worm slain, and all hailed Diodon goes on, a hero. His knights, his fellow knights, his brethren of the Order of St. John threw him on their shoulders and ran, clapping and happy, to the master, Helion, and told him the great success. But wroth was he, and angry, the master, because this knight dared actually break his command. Recall, the master had banned everyone from fighting and trying to kill this dragon because it had killed, reportedly, several knights and others, and it seemed a pointless venture. And so he was very angry, and this is an interesting point because it talks about discipline, and I like this personally. You know, you would think that everyone would be happy and the master should just congratulate him and everyone should hug, and what a great and joyous event. But the master kept an eye on discipline, vigilant. This is very important. And he just blew up on this young knight. Here, for example, is the quote, again, from the Chronicles of the Hospital, of the master's draconian response, no pun intended, which was ultimately meant to impress upon all his knights the importance of absolute obedience to an order. Remember, these essentially were monks. These were the military orders. These were warrior monks, like the Templars before them, the Knights of St. John. They took 3 vows, one of which was obedience, the other 2 being chastity and poverty. But this is about obedience we're talking about. Basically, according to this chronicle, the master said, I don't care if there's 1,000,000 dragons, or I don't care how many cattle you saved. You broke our rule with discipline, and that must be punished. Doesn't matter. That's more important than your slaying this dragon. So now envision this. His brethren knights have Diodon goes on their shoulders. They're celebrating. They're ecstatic. The dragon, the great worm, plaguing Rhodes, killing people, eating cattle, terrorizing everyone, has been slain by their brother. And they're carrying him to the master to show him so that he can join in the praise. What does he do? He frowns and he starts yelling at everyone. And this actually is pretty interesting. I kind of like it because it shows you the importance of discipline and obedience for these military orders, which were, of course, lacking today. So he chides this young knight and his fellows. And here's what the chronicle says. Immediately, this strict observer of discipline, without vouchsafing to hear him, or being moved in the least by the intercessions of the knights, sent him directly to prison. The strict observer of discipline is the master. He sent the young knight to prison, despite all the protestations of his fellow knights. Continues. He next convened a council, where he represented that the order could by no means dispense with inflicting a rigorous punishment on so notorious a disobedience. That was more prejudicial to discipline than the life of several serpents would have been to the cattle and inhabitants of that quarter of the island. But the council prevailed that he should only be deprived of the habit of the order, meaning be kicked out of the order, which was a pretty traumatic event for a knight of a military order. In short, the unfortunate knight was ignominiously degraded, and there was but a short interval between his victory and this kind of punishment, which he found more cruel and severe than death itself. Now, what's interesting is the master was really happy. He actually enjoyed and praised what this young knight did. It was heroic. But it was important for him to show everyone, including the other knights, that you can't just go around breaking rules. That there is consequences, there's a punishment. And even though it pained him to inflict this punishment, he thought it was necessary so everyone could understand the importance of obedience. And even the Chronicle explains this. So here we go. The Grand Master, after having by this chastisement, stripping him of his habit and throwing him in jail, performed the obligations due to the preservation of discipline, returned to his natural temper, and was pleased to be pacific, and managed things in such a manner as to make the other knights entreat him, to grant a pardon to the young knight, which he would have done himself if he had not been at the head of the order. At the pressing instances made by the principal commanders, he restored him to the habit and his favor, and loaded him with kindnesses. So he just wanted to make a point, a very important point, I would argue, which is the importance of discipline. So what, you kill a bunch of dragons? We can live with dragons. We can suffer from dragons. It's more important that we have discipline. That's the point, see? Now then, what's the point of this story? On the one hand, it's a nice story. It's a fun story. You may have heard stories about dragons, but this is an interesting one. We'll get into it. On the other hand, I do like the aspect of the obedience and the disobedience and how it all worked out. It really underscores the importance of discipline back in those days. All right, so what am I trying to say here? Am I trying to get you to believe that dragons exist? No. Like I said, I find it an interesting tale, one I'd like to share. And but there are some interesting factors that we can look at. Obviously, when you look at the story as I described it, and this attacking the dragon and stabbing it in its soft underbelly, I mean, it has parallels in mythology, or what we call mythology, whether it's Beowulf's dragon, or Sigurd's Fafnir, or even Tolkien's many fun dragons of Middle-earth. So first of all, the timing. This is the 14th century. The 14th century is not the 8th century. All right, 14th century is close to what we call the modern era. It only precedes the Renaissance by a few decades, honestly, and the scientific revolution. And my point is, the people of the 14th century, when this occurred, were not benighted, scared, superstitious Europeans who any lizard they see turned into a dragon. People were actually cognizant of reality, and they knew what exaggeration was. And not many people saw a dragon, not necessarily believing in a dragon, etc., etc. The second point is, this is recorded in the formal archives of the hospital of St. John. This was actually a rigorous, robust organization that took serious what it included. It was very skeptical. These are not, again, superstitious people who anyone who tells them there's a dragon, they're going to say it's a dragon. So there's actually some care taken into what they wrote and what they believe happened. Also, it's important to note that whereas a lot of myths revolve around ahistorical characters that never existed, in this case, the characters did exist. The master himself, Ilion or Helion, existed, but so did the Knight of Gozan, the actual dragon slayer. Not only was he a real historical figure, he became the Grand Master of the Knights of St. John, following the master that punished him. And we actually have stories about him fighting with Muslims and the crusade, launching the crusade, and etc., etc., all the sorts of things that I normally do write about, which is, by the way, why I came across this story that I'm sharing with you. So here's just one example. In 1347, Levon, the king of Lesser Armenia, who was being terrorized by the Muslims at the time, specifically the Mamluks of Egypt, having heard of the great prowess of the Knights of St. John, located in Rhodes, reached out and spoke to Diadon de Gozan and asked him for help and aid. Now, the chronicler explains it this way. He says, the problem is that the Armenians, the Orthodox Christians, were not in communion with Rome. They were schismatics. So technically, the Knights of the Hospital, Catholic order, should not have helped them as schismatics. But again, according to the chronicle, even though Levon was a schismatic, as the chronicle calls him, Gozan, our dragon slayer, quote, full of zeal and animated with the spirit of his institution, thought it his duty not to abandon any Christians to the fury of those savages. And then he prevailed upon the council of the order of St. John to send troops into Armenia, and he himself headed them, and they ended up fighting and beating back and repulsing the Mamluks, the Muslims of Egypt. Despite all that, it's sort of interesting to note that on his actual tombstone, he died in 1353, he's remembered by the words that are inscribed on it, which are Extinctor Draconis, which is basically signifying that here lies the dragon slayer. Now we can get into other reasons why this tale is not pure mythology. For example, again, according to the records, one Jean Thavenot, who died in 1667, he wrote that he saw the skull of the dragon when visiting Rhodes, and that it was, quote, much bigger and larger than that of a horse, its mouth reaching from ear to ear, big teeth, large eyes, the holes of the nostrils round, and the skin a whitish gray, occasioned perhaps by the dust which it gathered in the course of time. For me, however, the most compelling and interesting evidence has to do with the fact that Rhodes, from of old, was known as a nest of dragons and vipers. And this would be centuries before the Knights of St. John settled in Rhodes. So, for example, writing in the 1st century BC, that is 14 centuries before the dragon slaying anecdote I just shared with you, the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus noted that, quote, "The land of Rhodes brought forth huge serpents, and these serpents caused the death of many of the natives." And then he talks about the hero Phorbus, who, quote, "destroyed the serpents, and after he had freed the island of its fear, he made his home in Rhodes." But he's not the only one. So the Latin language Roman authored Astronomica, which was written during Christ's lifetime, so again, we're talking about 14 centuries before the slaying of the Dragon of Rhodes, adds that the constellation that we know as Ophiuchus, which really means master of the serpent, and which is represented by a man grappling with a large snake, is based on the aforementioned battle between the Greek hero Phorbus and large monsters of Rhodes. And this is what the Astronomica relays. The citizens of Rhodes called their island, overrun by a great number of snakes, Ophiusa, which is translated from Greek as land of serpents. In this multitude of beasts was a snake of immense size, which had killed many of them. And when the deserted land began finally to lack men, Phorbus, carried there by a storm, killed all the beasts, as well as that huge snake. Since he was especially favored by Apollo, the god, he was put among the constellations, shown killing the snake for the sake of praise and commemoration. So the point is, Rhodes from of old had a reputation of being a nest of vipers, large snakes and serpentine creatures. So much so that one of our constellations today is named after the dragon slayer or the snake killer of Rhodes, this same Phorbus. It's also interesting to note that a lot of scholars, I'm quoting one from the 17th century, and linguists say that even before the Greeks, the Phoenicians and other early Semites referred to the land of Rhodes as Gesiroth Rod, which is translated into the Isle of Serpents. In short, it seems fair to say that Diodon de Gozan, the knight in question, the knight of St. John of the Hospital, fought and grappled and killed some sort of large serpentine creature, maybe alligator-like, perhaps some sort of extinct descendant of these large worms that once infested and plagued Rhodes. As I already mentioned, however, it is not my intention to get you to believe in dragons. I just think this is an interesting story. Like I said, I don't see it on YouTube. It's not really being mentioned. It's kind of stuck right in there in the chronicles of Islam and Christendom at war. It's more recent than the usual dragon stories, Beowulf et al. And besides, it's Christmas time, and I don't want to talk about beheadings and whatnot. This has a Yuletide feel to it. Incidentally, if you managed to watch the entirety of this video without chuckling at my rather outlandish yet seasonally appropriate attire, congratulations. Other than that, Merry Christmas.